Hello, and welcome back to Let's Get Lit. In today's episode, we're going to be going over Part 2, Chapter 2 of George Orwell's classic 1984. So, things are starting to heat up and starting to progress. Let's see how this continues, and are there any consequences with Big Brother? Shall we? This chapter starts out with Winston out on the country road, getting ready to meet the dart-headed girl. He says that he followed all of her instructions and that he took the utmost caution in going there, as to not look suspicious. All along the small road there were a bunch of bluebells that were in bloom. He mentions quick snippets of his journey and that on the train he sat with a large family ranging in various ages, and then telling him about their journey and that they're taking. He also goes on to say that luckily the trip was very successful and that no one seemed to have followed him. As he's on the lane, he bends down and picks up flowers for the dark-headed girl. Suddenly, he hears a twig snapping behind him, but he doesn't dare look for fear of looking suspicious or guilty. Just then, a hand appears on his shoulder, and it's the girl, telling him to keep looking forward and to follow her. They make their way down the road, and she leads, knowing every step of the way. Once they get to a secluded area with trees all around, she then lets him know that it's safe to speak. She also lets him know that the reason that she didn't really talk to him on the road was because you never know if microphones were hidden somewhere, and people were listening in. After Winston gets over his initial fear and anxiety, they begin to have a small conversation, and she makes her way towards him, and they begin to kiss. Winston then lets the reader know that he is very happy, and they're both here together, but physically he's not excited. He chalks this up to the fact that he hasn't been with a woman in so long, and that because living without women for so long takes a toll on his body, and he's not used to it. She says that everything is okay, and he asks her what her name is. She replies that her name is Julia, but she knows his name, and it's Winston Smith. She then asks him what his initial thought of her was before she slipped him the note that said, "I love you." Winston takes this moment to be incredibly truthful and tells her that beforehand he had thoughts of murdering her and raping her. He also said that just 2 weeks ago, whenever he thought she was following him, he wanted to track her down and bash her brains in with a brownstone, killing her. Winston says that he doesn't hold back because he'd rather be truthful up front. Upon hearing this, she begins to laugh because she asks if he thought she was part of the thought police, and he confirms that he did believe she was part of the thought police. She says that she can't blame him because she motions to the anti-sex league stash that she has on. She understands that he thought she was a good party member in words and in deeds. She then rips off the sash and tosses it aside. After this, she pulls out a square of chocolate and breaks it in half and gives half to Winston. As Winston is smelling the chocolate, he realizes that this chocolate is not like the typical kind he's had back in the city. The one that he has eaten previously kind of tasted like burnt ash. This chocolate, however, reminded him or brought up a memory that he'd had from long ago. He mentions that this type of chocolate is very delicious and has a great taste to it. As he continues to eat the chocolate, this vague memory continues to pop in his mind, but he can't place it. He asks her where she got it, and she said the black market. She goes on to say that she's not as good as she appears to be, and that she gets quite a lot of things from the black market itself. She says that she's able to put on a great persona of being an excellent party member. She then goes into all the ways she contributes to this image of herself, from volunteering at the Junior Anti-Sex League every week, to making sure that she yells during the 2-minute hate, to even holding up the banners during parades for the Junior Anti-Sex League. He mentions that she's very young, about 10 or 15 years younger than he is, and he asks her what it is about him that attracts her to him. She says that it was something in his face, that she thought she could take a chance on him, and she mentions she's good at spotting people who don't belong. She says that as soon as she saw him, she knew that he was against them, meaning the party and the inner party. One thing that astonishes him about her is how openly she talks about the party and her hatred towards them, all while using vulgar language. Winston notes how party members are not supposed to use foul language at all. He then mentions that soon they walk past the clearing and they are holding each other, looking out into the countryside. He also noted that they did not speak above a whisper. That way, in case there were microphones, the people on the other end could not hear what they were saying. As they were looking out into the countryside, Winston knows that this scene looks very familiar and that he's seen it before. Winston mentions the dream from earlier in part 1 about this country lane, and he asks Julia if there happened to be a stream not too far away. She says yes, and that if you're lucky, sometimes there are fish who live in this stream, and you can watch them play in the water. Winston immediately thinks that this is the Golden Country, and he murmurs this to himself. She asks, "The Golden Country?" And he says, "Oh, it's nothing really. It's a landscape that he sometimes sees in his dreams." Julia then whispers, "Look." and a bird had aligned on one of the boughs not 5 meters away from them, almost at face level. They watch the bird, and it opens its wings and hides its head and then begins to make sounds. As it's making these sounds, Winston is wondering why, when there's no prey or partners for the bird anywhere nearby. As he's holding her again in his arms, he pulls her around to him and they begin to kiss. These kisses now being softer than the ones they previously shared. He asks, "Now?" and she says, "Not here. Go back to the hideout where it's safer." They make their way back to the hideout and she begins to take off her clothes. He stares at her beautiful body and then kneels down before her and takes her hands in his. He asks her if she's done this before and she says, "Oh yeah, hundreds of times." He asks, "With party members?" and she said, "Yes, always with party members." And then he asks, "What about the inner party?" She said, "No, not with them, but there's plenty that would if they'd gotten a chance." She tells Winston that they're not nearly as holy as they make themselves out to be. As she's telling him all of this, he gets more and more excited because he begins to think of the party being rotten underneath the surface of its cult of strenuousness and self-denial. He then thinks how he wished he could have inflicted the whole lot of them with leprosy or syphilis, and how he gladly would have done it. He then pulls her down to him and they're face to face. He tells her that the more she talks, the more he loves her, and asks if she understands him. She said yes, perfectly. Winston tells her that he hates purity and he hates goodness. He doesn't want any virtue to exist anywhere. He wants everyone to be corrupt to the bone. She then responds that she ought to suit him perfectly because she was corrupt to the bone. He then asks if she enjoyed the act of sex, and she said that she adores it. This thrills Winston above anything else because that's all he's ever wanted to hear. Not merely the love of one person, but the animalistic instinct to simply undifferentiated desire. That was the force that would tear the party to pieces. They then proceed to have sex, and after, they each fall asleep for about half an hour. Winston wakes up first and he watches her freckled face, still peacefully asleep, pillowed on the palm of her hands. It then occurs to him that he still doesn't know her surname or where she lives. He then mentions that in the older days, men would have simply just looked at the girl's body and saw it as desirable, and that would be the end of the story. But now you could not have pure love or pure lust. No emotion was pure because everything was mixed up with fear and hatred. Winston says their embrace had been a battle, a climax of victory, and that it was a blow struck against the party. The act itself was political. This is where Chapter 2 ends of Part 2. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, stay lit.